the banker's wife, ambushed by robbers. Apache protected her, freed her, and he was treated like family. The ambush on Devil's Canyon Road. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trail leading from San Antonio to Cedar Creek, its rays creating shimmering mirages on the hardpan earth. Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore adjusted her parasol for the 100th time, her fine silk dress already damp with perspiration despite the carriage's modest shade. The rhythmic clatter of hooves and wheels had become hypnotic during the 3-hour journey, and she found herself nodding off despite the rough terrain. "Mrs. Whitmore, we're approaching Devil's Canyon," called out Samuel, their elderly driver, his weathered hands gripping the reins tighter. "Always makes me nervous, this stretch does." Margaret peered through the carriage window at the jagged red rocks rising on either side of the narrow road. The canyon walls cast long shadows, providing blessed relief from the heat but also creating an ominous atmosphere. As the wife of Cedar Creek's most prominent banker, she had made this journey dozens of times, but something felt different today. The usual bird songs were absent, replaced by an eerie silence that made her skin crawl. "How much further, Samuel?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of anxiety. "About 2 miles to clear the canyon, ma'am. Then it's smooth sailing to..." A gunshot cracked through the air like thunder, followed immediately by Samuel's anguished cry. The carriage lurched violently as the horses reared in terror, their frightened whinnies echoing off the canyon walls. Margaret was thrown against the side of the carriage, her head striking the wooden frame with a sickening thud. "Well, well, what have we here?" The voice was rough and menacing, accompanied by the sound of approaching horses. "Looks like we caught ourselves a fine lady." Through her dazed vision, Margaret saw 3 men on horseback emerge from behind the rocks. Their faces were hidden behind dirty bandanas, but their eyes gleamed with malicious intent. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down his left cheek, dismounted and approached the carriage with predatory confidence. "Please," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible as blood trickled from a cut on her forehead. "Take whatever you want, but please don't hurt us." The scarred man laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humanity. "Oh, we intend to take everything, lady, starting with that pretty jewelry you're wearing." He reached for the carriage door, his grimy fingers already anticipating the riches within. But as his hand touched the handle, a shadow fell across the ground. The man looked up, confusion replacing his cruel confidence. Standing on the canyon rim above them was a figure silhouetted against the blazing sun, tall, motionless, and somehow radiating an aura of quiet power. "What in the hell?" the bandit began, but his words were cut short as the figure leaped down from the rocks with fluid grace, landing silently on the sandy ground 20 feet away. The Apache warrior stood with the stillness of a mountain cat, his bronze skin gleaming in the dappled sunlight. His long black hair was bound with a leather cord, and intricate blue and white beadwork adorned his buckskin shirt. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, dark, intelligent, and filled with an ancient wisdom that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. "You will leave now," he said, his English clear and precise despite the slight accent. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority, as if he expected nothing less than immediate compliance. The scarred bandit recovered from his initial shock and drew his revolver, pointing it directly at the Apache's chest. "I don't know who you think you are, Redskin, but you picked the wrong fight. There's 3 of us and 1 of you." The Apache's expression didn't change, but Margaret noticed his right hand move almost imperceptibly to rest on the handle of a knife at his belt. The air itself seemed to grow thicker, charged with the tension of impending violence. "3 cowards who prey on women," the Apache replied calmly, "against 1 who fights for honor. The spirits know which side they favor." What happened next occurred so quickly that Margaret could barely follow it. The Apache moved like liquid lightning, rolling to the side as the bandit's gun discharged harmlessly into the air. In one fluid motion, he drew his knife and threw it with deadly precision, the blade embedding itself in the wooden stock of the second bandit's rifle, rendering it useless. The third bandit, seeing his companions struggling, spurred his horse forward with a wild yell, but the Apache was already in motion, scooping up a handful of sand and throwing it into the lead bandit's eyes before grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it with such force that the revolver clattered to the ground. "My eyes, I can't see!" the scarred man screamed, stumbling backward and clutching his face. The Apache retrieved his knife and stood perfectly still once more, his dark eyes moving from one bandit to the next. "You have seen Apache justice. Leave now, or face Apache war." The bandits needed no further encouragement. Helping their half-blind leader onto his horse, they rode away in a cloud of dust, their horses' hooves echoing off the canyon walls until the sound faded into the distance. Margaret sat in stunned silence, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The Apache turned to her, and for the first time, his stern expression softened slightly. "Are you hurt?" he asked, approaching the carriage with careful, non-threatening movements. I think so," she stammered, touching the cut on her forehead. "My head and Samuel." She looked toward the driver's seat where the old man sat slumped over, a spreading stain of red on his shirt. The Apache moved quickly to Samuel's side, his skilled hands examining the wound with practiced efficiency. "The bullet passed through his shoulder. He will live, but he needs medicine and rest." He looked back at Margaret with those penetrating dark eyes. "Can you drive?" "Drive?" Margaret's mind reeled. As the pampered wife of a wealthy banker, she had never held reins in her life. No, I've never." "Then I will take you to safety," the Apache said simply. "My horse can carry us both to your town." Margaret hesitated, her upbringing screaming warnings about trusting a stranger, especially an Apache. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw only honesty and genuine concern. This man had just risked his life to save hers, asking nothing in return. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did you help us?" The Apache was quiet for a long moment, his gaze turning toward the canyon walls where ancient petroglyphs told stories of his people. "Because it was right," he said finally. "Because the spirits brought me here at this moment, and I do not ignore their wisdom." As he helped her down from the carriage and onto his horse, Margaret felt her world shifting in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. The comfortable certainties of her privileged life had been shattered in a matter of minutes, replaced by questions she had never thought to ask. The Apache's name was Joseph Running Bear, though she wouldn't learn this until later. For now, he was simply her savior, a man who had appeared from nowhere to stand between her and certain death. As they rode toward Cedar Creek, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter would change everything. Behind them, Samuel managed to guide the carriage slowly along the trail, his wound painful but not life-threatening. The three of them made an unlikely procession: the wealthy banker's wife, the Apache warrior, and the injured driver, united by circumstances none of them could have imagined that morning. As the lights of Cedar Creek appeared in the distance, Margaret realized that her old life was ending, and something entirely new was about to begin. She just had no idea how profound that change would be. The dead of honor, the dusty main street of Cedar Creek buzzed with evening activity, as shopkeepers prepared to close and cowboys drifted toward the saloons after a long day's work. But all conversation stopped as an extraordinary sight appeared at the town's edge. Margaret Whitmore, the banker's wife, riding behind an Apache warrior on a paint horse, her fine dress torn and stained with blood. "Sweet Jesus," whispered Doc Harrison, dropping his medical bag as he stepped out of his office. "Is that Mrs. Whitmore?" Joseph Running Bear brought his horse to a gentle stop in front of the doctor's office, his keen eyes taking in the crowd of curious onlookers that was rapidly gathering. Some faces showed concern, others suspicion, and a few displayed the kind of naked hostility he had learned to recognize over the years. "Dr. Harrison," Margaret called out, her voice hoarse from the dust and trauma. "Samuel's been shot. He needs immediate attention." The doctor, a kind-faced man in his 50s who had seen his share of frontier violence, immediately shifted into professional mode. "Bring him inside," he commanded, gesturing toward his office. "Mrs. Whitmore, what happened?" As Joseph helped her down from the horse, Margaret noticed how the crowd kept its distance, their eyes fixed on her companion with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Children peered around their mother's skirts, and she could hear whispered conversations beginning to spread through the gathering. "Bandits," Margaret said simply. "3 of them ambushed us at Devil's Canyon. If not for—" She turned to look at Joseph, realizing she didn't even know his name. "Joseph Running Bear," he said quietly, his English precise despite the slight accent, "of the Lipan Apache." The name seemed to ripple through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Margaret heard fragments of whispered conversations. "That's the medicine man from the reservation. Heard he can heal anything. Saved the Thompson boy from fever last winter." Dr. Harrison approached cautiously, his medical training overriding his cultural prejudices. "You're the one they call the healer," he said, recognition dawning in his eyes. "I've heard stories about your medicine." Joseph nodded once, his expression remaining neutral. "The old ways still have power," he said, "but your white medicine is also strong. Samuel needs both." By this time, Samuel had managed to drive the carriage into town, though he was clearly in significant pain. Several townspeople rushed to help him down, and Dr. Harrison quickly examined the wound. "Clean through the shoulder," the doctor announced after a brief inspection. "Missed the major arteries, but he's lost a fair amount of blood." He looked up at Joseph with newfound respect. "You bound this wound?" "With what I had," Joseph replied, "but he will need proper stitching and medicine to prevent infection." As doctor, Harrison and his assistant carried Samuel into the office. Margaret found herself standing alone with Joseph in the middle of the increasingly crowded street. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings, and she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon them. "Margaret!" The voice boomed across the street, and she turned to see her husband, Charles Whitmore, pushing through the crowd. He was a tall, distinguished man in his mid-40s, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of commanding presence that came from years of financial success. "Charles," she breathed, relief flooding through her as he reached her side. But she noticed how his eyes immediately moved to Joseph, assessing him with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to evaluating risk. "What happened?" Charles demanded, his arm encircling his wife protectively. "The whole town's talking about bandits and—" His voice trailed off as he took in Joseph's appearance more fully. "This man saved my life," Margaret said firmly, her voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet street. "3 bandits ambushed us at Devil's Canyon. They would have killed us both if not for his courage." Charles looked at Joseph with new eyes, the businessman in him quickly calculating the debt owed. "Is this true?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I did what was necessary," Joseph replied simply. "No more, no less." The crowd had continued to grow, and Margaret became aware of the spectacle they were creating. Word was spreading quickly through the small town, and she could see people emerging from shops and homes to witness this unusual scene. "What's your name, friend?" Charles asked, extending his hand in a gesture that surprised many of the onlookers. "Joseph Running Bear," came the reply, and Margaret watched as the 2 men shook hands, the wealthy banker and the Apache warrior, an unlikely pair united by circumstance. "Mr. Running Bear," Charles said, his voice now carrying the formal tone he used for important business matters. "My wife tells me you saved her life. That creates a debt that can never be fully repaid, but I intend to try." Joseph shook his head slightly. "I ask for nothing. The spirits guided me to that place at that time. To ignore their wisdom would be to dishonor my ancestors." This response seemed to puzzle Charles, who was accustomed to dealing with people who wanted something in return for their services. "Surely there must be something." "There is nothing," Joseph said firmly. "Your wife is safe. That is enough." Margaret watched this exchange with growing fascination. In her world, everything had a price. Every favor carried an obligation. But here was a man who had risked his life for strangers and asked nothing in return. It challenged everything she thought she knew about human nature. "At least allow us to offer you hospitality," Charles insisted. "A meal, a place to rest. It's the least we can do." Joseph considered this for a long moment, his dark eyes moving from Charles to Margaret and back again. "I will accept your hospitality," he said finally, "but only as a friend, not as payment for duty." The crowd began to disperse as the drama of the moment subsided, but Margaret noticed that many people lingered, clearly eager to hear more details about the encounter. She realized that this story would be told and retold throughout the town, probably growing in the telling. As they walked toward the Whitmore house, a large 2-story Victorian mansion that served as a symbol of Charles's success, Margaret found herself stealing glances at Joseph. He moved with the fluid grace of a natural athlete, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings in the manner of someone accustomed to potential danger. "You live on the reservation?" Charles asked as they walked. "Sometimes," Joseph replied. "I go where I am needed. The sick do not always live in one place." "You're a doctor?" Margaret asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. "I am what you might call a healer," Joseph said carefully. "I know the old ways, the medicine of plants and spirits. But I also respect the power of your white medicine." They reached the Whitmore house, its whitewashed walls and manicured garden standing in stark contrast to the rugged frontier landscape beyond. As they climbed the front steps, Margaret caught sight of their neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, watching from her window with undisguised shock. "Maria," Charles called out as they entered the house, "we have a guest for dinner." Their housekeeper, a middle-aged Mexican woman who had worked for the Whitmores for nearly a decade, appeared from the kitchen. Her eyes widened as she took in the sight of Joseph, but her expression quickly shifted to one of respectful interest. "Maria, this is Joseph Running Bear," Margaret said. "He saved my life today." Maria's attitude immediately transformed. She approached Joseph with the kind of reverence reserved for those who had performed miracles. "Señor Running Bear," she said, her English heavily accented but sincere. "Mi casa es su casa. You are welcome here." Joseph smiled for the first time since Margaret had met him, and the expression transformed his entire face. "Gracias, señora. Your kindness honors me." As Maria bustled away to prepare dinner, Charles led Joseph into the parlor, a room filled with expensive furniture and symbols of prosperity. Joseph's eyes moved over the oil paintings, the crystal decanters, and the Persian rugs with the same careful attention he had given to the canyon walls. "Can I offer you something to drink?" Charles asked. "Whiskey? Wine?" Water would be good, Joseph replied, settling into a chair with unconscious dignity. The desert makes a man thirsty. Margaret excused herself to clean up and change clothes, but she found herself hurrying through her preparations, eager to return to the conversation downstairs. Something about Joseph intrigued her beyond simple gratitude. There was a depth to him, a quiet wisdom that seemed to come from sources she couldn't begin to understand. When she returned, she found Charles and Joseph engaged in an animated discussion about the changing nature of the frontier. Joseph spoke with the perspective of someone who had watched the transformation from both sides, and his insights were proving enlightening to her husband. "The railroad will bring many changes," Joseph was saying. "Some good, some not so good. But change is like the wind. It cannot be stopped, only adapted to." "You seem to understand the white man's world very well," Charles observed. "I have learned that understanding brings survival," Joseph replied. "My people have not always been wise about this, but wisdom can be learned if one is willing to listen." As they sat down to dinner, Margaret realized that this evening was unlike any she had ever experienced. The conversation flowed between topics she had never considered: the relationship between different cultures, the nature of healing, the balance between tradition and progress. Joseph spoke with quiet authority about things that challenged her assumptions about the world. "You mentioned the spirits earlier," she said during a lull in the conversation. "Can you tell me more about that?" Joseph set down his fork and considered her question carefully. "Your people speak of God," he said finally. "We speak of spirits. Perhaps we are talking about the same thing, only using different words." "That's an interesting way to look at it," Charles said, clearly intrigued despite himself. "All wisdom comes from the same source," Joseph continued. "The Apache way, the White way, the Mexican way, they are all paths up the same mountain. The mistake is thinking that only one path leads to the top." Margaret found herself hanging on every word. This was a perspective she had never encountered, a way of thinking that seemed to embrace complexity rather than demanding simple answers. As the evening wore on, she began to understand that the debt her husband spoke of was more than financial. This man had not only saved her life, he had opened a door to a world of ideas and possibilities she had never imagined. But she also sensed that accepting Joseph's gift would require something from her in return. Not money or material goods, but a willingness to question everything she thought she knew about the world and her place in it. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky outside, Margaret realized that her transformation had only just begun. Bridges between worlds. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the Whitmore household, Sheriff Tom Bradley. A weathered man in his 50s with a star-shaped scar on his left cheek stood on the front porch with his hat in his hands, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Morning, Charles," he said, nodding toward the banker. "Heard you had some excitement yesterday." Charles invited him in, and Margaret noticed how the sheriff's eyes immediately sought out Joseph, who was sitting at the kitchen table sharing breakfast with Maria. The two had discovered a mutual appreciation for strong coffee and were engaged in animated conversation in Spanish. "Sheriff Bradley," Charles said formally, "I'd like you to meet Joseph Running Bear. He's the man who saved my wife's life." The sheriff approached cautiously, his hand resting unconsciously on his gun belt. "Mr. Running Bear," he said, his voice neutral but wary, "I've heard quite a story about what happened at Devil's Canyon." Joseph rose from his chair with fluid grace, his dark eyes meeting the sheriff steadily. "Sheriff Bradley," he said, extending his hand, "I am honored to meet you." The handshake was brief but firm, and Margaret watched as the two men took each other's measure. She could sense the undercurrents of suspicion and respect flowing between them like competing rivers. "I'll need to hear your account of what happened," the sheriff said, "for the official record." "Of course," Joseph replied. "I will tell you exactly what I saw." As Joseph recounted the events of the previous day, Margaret found herself reliving the terror of those moments, but hearing it from his perspective, she gained new insight into the calculated nature of his actions. Every move had been deliberate, designed to neutralize the threat while minimizing violence. "You could have killed them," Sheriff Bradley observed when Joseph finished his account. "Yes," Joseph said simply, "but dead men cannot learn from their mistakes. Sometimes mercy teaches more than justice." The sheriff looked puzzled by this response. "You're not worried they'll come back for revenge?" "Men who prey on women and old men are cowards," Joseph replied. "They will find easier targets." After the sheriff left, Charles departed for the bank, leaving Margaret alone with Joseph for the first time since the rescue. She found herself oddly nervous, unsure how to bridge the gap between their vastly different worlds. "Would you like to see the garden?" she asked finally. "I've been working on it for years." Joseph nodded, and they walked out onto the back porch. Margaret's garden was her pride and joy, a carefully cultivated space filled with roses, lilies, and other flowers that required constant attention in the harsh Texas climate. "Beautiful," Joseph said, but his attention seemed focused on a small section near the back fence where weeds had been allowed to grow wild. "Oh, that," Margaret said, embarrassed. "I've been meaning to clear that area, but I haven't had time." Joseph knelt beside the weedy patch, his fingers gently touching the leaves of various plants. "These are not weeds," he said quietly. "This is willow bark for pain. This is chamomile for sleep, and this," he picked up a small, inconspicuous plant. "This is purple coneflower, very powerful medicine." Margaret stared at the neglected corner of her garden with new eyes. "You mean these plants are actually useful?" "All plants have purpose," Joseph said, still examining the specimens. "Your people sometimes forget this, but the knowledge is still there, waiting to be remembered." "Could you teach me?" The words came out before Margaret could stop them, surprising her with their intensity. Joseph looked up at her with those penetrating dark eyes. "You wish to learn the old ways?" "I wish to learn," Margaret said simply. "About plants, about healing, about everything." Something shifted in Joseph's expression, a guardedness giving way to genuine interest. "Learning requires more than curiosity," he said. "It requires changing how you see the world." "I think my world changed yesterday," Margaret replied. "I just don't know what it's become yet." Over the following days, an unusual routine developed. Joseph would arrive each morning and spend time in the garden with Margaret, teaching her to identify medicinal plants and explaining their properties. Word of these lessons spread quickly through the town, causing no small amount of gossip and speculation. "It's unseemly," Mrs. Henderson complained to anyone who would listen. "A woman of her position spending so much time with, well, you know." But Margaret found herself caring less about social conventions with each passing day. Joseph's knowledge was vast and deep, encompassing not just plants, but the entire natural world and humanity's place within it. "Why do you know so much about our ways?" she asked one afternoon as they worked together preparing a poultice for Samuel's wound. "Knowledge is survival," Joseph replied, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. "My grandfather told me, the world is changing and we must change with it or be swept away like leaves in a flood." Was he a medicine man too? He was many things. Warrior, healer, diplomat. He understood that the old ways and the new ways could exist together, like different colors in the same weaving. Margaret paused in her work. "Is that what you're doing? Weaving old and new together?" "I am trying to," Joseph said, "but it is not easy. Your people fear what they do not understand. My people sometimes fear change itself." The truth of this became apparent when Joseph's cousin, Thomas Crow Feather, arrived unexpectedly at the Whitmore house. He was a younger man, perhaps 30, with the lean build of a warrior and eyes that held barely contained anger. "Joseph," he said in Apache, his tone sharp with disapproval, "the elders are talking. They say you spend too much time with the white eyes, that you forget who you are." Joseph responded in English, his voice calm but firm. "I have forgotten nothing, Thomas. I am exactly who I have always been. You live in their house, eat their food, teach their women our sacred knowledge," Thomas continued, switching to English so Margaret could understand. "This is not our way. Our way is to help those who need help," Joseph replied. "Our way is to heal, not to hate." Margaret felt the tension between the two men like a physical force. She started to excuse herself, but Joseph motioned for her to stay. "Thomas Crowfeather," he said formally, "this is Margaret Whitmore. She is the woman whose life I saved, and she is now my student." Thomas's eyes flicked to Margaret with barely concealed disdain. "Your student? You teach Apache medicine to white women now?" "I teach healing to anyone willing to learn," Joseph said. "The plants do not care about the color of the hands that use them. The elders will not approve," Thomas warned. "The elders are wise," Joseph replied. "They will understand when they see the results." After Thomas left, Margaret found herself shaken by the encounter. "Am I causing problems for you?" she asked. Joseph was quiet for a long moment. "Change always causes problems," he said finally. "The question is whether the problems are worth the benefits. And are they? I believe so, but others may not agree." The challenge to Joseph's teaching came from an unexpected source. Dr. Harrison, who had initially been supportive of the collaboration, began to express concerns about unscientific practices and dangerous folk remedies. "I'm not saying his methods don't work," the doctor told Charles during a private meeting, "but we don't understand how or why. That makes them unpredictable, possibly dangerous." Charles, caught between his debt to Joseph and his position in the community, found himself in an increasingly difficult position. "The man saved my wife's life," he said. "I can't simply dismiss his knowledge." "I'm not asking you to dismiss it," Dr. Harrison replied. "I'm asking you to be careful. Your wife is spending a lot of time with him, and people are beginning to talk." The gossip had indeed intensified. Margaret could feel the weight of whispered conversations and disapproving glances whenever she appeared in public. Some of the town's more prominent ladies had begun to avoid her, and she sensed that her position in Cedar Creek's social hierarchy was beginning to shift. "Does it bother you?" Joseph asked one day as they worked in the garden. The way they look at you? Margaret considered the question carefully. It should bother me more than it does, she said finally. A month ago, their approval was the most important thing in my life. Now I'm not sure what's important anymore. Everything I thought I knew about the world has been turned upside down. Joseph smiled, that rare expression that transformed his entire face. That is the beginning of wisdom, he said, to know that you do not know. As the weeks passed, Margaret found herself caught between two worlds. Her old life, with its comfortable certainties and social expectations, seemed increasingly hollow, but the new world that Joseph was revealing to her was vast and complex, full of wonders and challenges she had never imagined. The tension came to a head when Margaret successfully treated the blacksmith's daughter, using a combination of Joseph's herbal remedies and techniques she had learned from watching him work. The girl's fever broke after 3 days, and she made a full recovery. "It's a miracle," the blacksmith told anyone who would listen. Mrs. Whitmore knew exactly what to do, but not everyone saw it as a miracle. "It's witchcraft," whispered others. "She's been spending too much time with that Apache. He's filling her head with heathen ideas." Margaret found herself at the center of a controversy she had never sought. Some people praised her new skills, while others viewed them with suspicion and fear. The comfortable middle ground she had always occupied was disappearing, forcing her to choose sides in a conflict she was only beginning to understand. "I'm sorry," she told Joseph one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "I never meant for this to cause so much trouble." "Growth is always troublesome," Joseph replied. "A seed must break open before it can become a tree. But what if the tree doesn't survive the breaking? Then it was not meant to be a tree," Joseph said simply. "But I think you are stronger than you know." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Margaret realized that her transformation was far from complete. The person she had been was dying, but the person she was becoming was still taking shape. And somewhere in the space between those two identities, she was beginning to discover who she really was. The test of character. The crisis came on a sweltering Thursday morning in late July. Margaret was in the garden with Joseph, carefully transplanting some wild ginseng he had found in the hills, when Maria burst through the back door with tears streaming down her face. "Señora Margaret," she cried. "Venga rapido, my grandson, he is very sick, the fever, it burns him up." Margaret immediately set down her tools and followed Maria into the house with Joseph close behind. They found little Miguel, Maria's 8-year-old grandson, lying on a makeshift bed in the kitchen, his small body racked with convulsions and burning with fever. "How long has he been like this?" Joseph asked, kneeling beside the boy and placing a gentle hand on his forehead. "Since yesterday night," Maria sobbed. "I gave him willow bark tea like you taught me, but nothing helps. Please, you must save him." Joseph's examination was swift but thorough. His experienced hands checked the boy's pulse, examined his eyes, and felt for swollen glands. Margaret watched intently, trying to read the expression on his face. "This is serious," Joseph said finally. "The fever is very high, and there are signs of infection. We need to act quickly. I'll send for Dr. Harrison," Margaret said, moving toward the door. "No," Joseph's voice was firm. "By the time he arrives, it may be too late. We must begin treatment now." Margaret hesitated. She had learned much from Joseph over the past weeks, but this was different. This was life and death, and Miguel was just a child. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, pushing aside her doubts. "First, we need to bring down the fever," Joseph said, his voice calm and authoritative. "Prepare a cold bath with ice from the ice house. Then gather willow bark, elderflower, and feverfew. I'll need my medicine bag." As Margaret hurried to gather the required materials, she could hear Joseph speaking softly to Miguel in Spanish, his voice soothing and confident. When she returned, he was preparing a complex herbal mixture with the precision of a skilled pharmacist. "This will help fight the infection," he explained as he worked. "But the fever is the immediate danger. We must cool his body while giving his spirit strength to fight." The next several hours were a blur of activity. Margaret found herself acting as Joseph's assistant, following his instructions with growing confidence. They alternated between cooling baths and herbal treatments, monitoring Miguel's condition with the intensity of battlefield medics. "The fever is breaking," Joseph announced around midday, relief evident in his voice. "But he's not out of danger yet. We need to watch for complications." Margaret sank into a chair, exhausted but exhilarated. She had helped save a life using knowledge she had gained from Joseph. The feeling was unlike anything she had ever experienced, but their celebration was short-lived. Dr. Harrison arrived with Sheriff Bradley, both men looking grim and determined. "Mrs. Whitmore," Dr. Harrison said formally, "I understand you've been practicing medicine without proper training or licensing." "I've been helping a sick child," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the flutter of anxiety in her chest, "using unproven methods and potentially dangerous remedies." the doctor continued. This is highly irregular and possibly illegal. Joseph stepped forward, his expression calm but alert. The boy is recovering, he said simply. Judge the treatment by its results. Dr. Harrison examined Miguel, his professional demeanor gradually giving way to puzzlement. His fever has broken, he admitted. His breathing is clear and his color is improving. But that doesn't mean... It doesn't mean what? Margaret challenged. That unconventional methods can't work? That knowledge passed down through generations has no value? It means, Sheriff Bradley interjected, that you've been causing quite a stir in town. Some folks are saying you're practicing witchcraft. The word hung in the air like a curse. Margaret felt her world shifting once again, but this time towards something darker and more dangerous. Witchcraft? She said, her voice rising. I used willow bark and elderflower, not magic spells, plants that grow in God's own earth. Nevertheless, Dr. Harrison said, I'm concerned about the precedent this sets. People might think they can treat serious illnesses without proper medical training. And what is proper medical training? Joseph asked quietly. 10 years of study or a lifetime of practice? Books written by men who never treated a patient, or knowledge passed down from healer to healer for countless generations? The tension in the room was palpable. Margaret could see the conflict playing out on multiple levels. Professional jealousy, cultural prejudice, and genuine concern for public safety all mixed together in a volatile combination. I think, said a new voice from the doorway, that we should be celebrating the fact that a child's life has been saved. They turned to see Charles standing in the entrance, his expression serious but supportive. Behind him stood several other townspeople, including the blacksmith whose daughter Margaret had treated weeks earlier. Charles, Dr. Harrison said, I understand your loyalty to your wife, but my loyalty is to the truth, Charles interrupted. And the truth is that my wife and Joseph Running Bear have done nothing but help people. They've treated fever, infection, and injury using methods that work, but without proper authorization. The sheriff,